It's one of the most unsettling maritime mysteries ever recorded. Here is the story of the men who vanished from a lonely lighthouse on the edge of the Atlantic, and the silence that has followed ever since. This is the disappearance at Eilean Mòr in the year 1900, a case that has confused investigators, inspired legends, and left one hard question that still hangs in the salt air. What happened to the keepers of the Flannan Isles lighthouse? Far off the northwest coast of Scotland, beyond the long sweep of the Hebrides, the sea breaks around a scattered group of rocks and small islands called the Flannan Isles. Sailors sometimes called them the Seven Hunters. The largest is Eilean Mòr, a bare shoulder of rock topped with short grass and wind-twisted ground, a place where seabirds rule the sky and winter storms hit with a weight that rattles bones. Near the highest point of that island stands a white tower with a lantern of glass and brass, the Flannan Isles lighthouse. It had been finished in 1899 to guard a dangerous stretch of ocean. It stood 75 feet tall, its light raised high above the sea, meant to be a steady warning, a fixed point of comfort for crews fighting through black winter nights. Life inside that tower followed a strict rhythm. 3 keepers served at a time, with a 4th man on the mainland rotating in as relief. Their work was simple but relentless. Clean the lantern, trim the wicks, keep the oil ready, check the clockwork that drove the lens, watch the weather, log the day, keep the place orderly. On clear nights, the lantern had to be brought up to full strength before dusk, and kept burning until dawn. In fog, the horn had to sound. In storms, everything had to be secured so wind and waves could not tear equipment loose. A tender ship, the Hesperus, brought supplies and a new keeper when the schedule called for it, but for weeks at a time the men were alone with wind, rain, rock, and the thud of waves slamming the cliffs. In December of 1900, the team on Eilean Mòr was made up of 3 men with hard, work-worn hands. The principal keeper was James Ducat, experienced and steady. The second was Thomas Marshall, younger, diligent, and known to be careful. The third was Donald MacArthur, an occasional keeper brought in as a temporary hand, strong and capable, a man who had worked outdoors all his life. They were different in age and background, but they shared a single job: protect the light, record each day in the log, and be there when the tender came. Winter moved in fast that year. The days had turned short, the Atlantic had a cold steel color, and storms marched in one after another across the open water. Around December the 15th, a passing ship noted that the light at Eilean Mòr was dark when it should have been lit. The crew reported this after reaching port. There were still heavy seas for days, and the Hesperus could not get out to the island at once. On December 26th, the tender finally pushed through the swells and reached the landing place beneath the lighthouse. The captain, James Harvey, looked up expecting to see a flag flying at the mast to show they had sighted the tender. There was no flag. No relief crew stood by the landing with ropes ready, no movement. No figure watching from the rail on the cliff, only the sea and the wind. The captain sounded the ship's horn, no answer. He fired a rocket in the air, still nothing. The men on deck felt a cold ripple of concern. A small boat put down into the rough water, and relief keeper Joseph Moore went ashore alone. He climbed, pulled the boat against the ladder at the landing, and climbed. The path up the cliff was slick with spray. Every step scraped on wet stone. At the top, Moore found the gate shut. The rail near the pathway creaked in the wind. He reached the lighthouse compound and saw the front door closed. Inside, the entry was neat. The kitchen door stood open. In the kitchen area, the stove was cold. The clock on the wall had stopped. The beds were empty. The oilskins, the heavy coats that kept a man dry, were missing for 2 of the keepers. One everyday coat still hung on its hook. The light at the top of the tower showed signs it had been prepared days earlier but not lit again. Somewhere in that small space of stone and brass and iron, 3 men had vanished. Moore searched each room. He called out their names. The only answer was wind through the cracks and the distant clap of waves on rock. He ran back down to the landing and signaled to the Hesperus that the station was deserted. The crew formed search parties. They looked along the paths, the slopes, and the edges of the cliff. They checked both the east landing and the west landing, 2 small places on the island where a boat could try to touch the rock. At the west landing, where the full force of the Atlantic hits, they found damage that spoke of recent storms. A box that held mooring ropes had been washed away. Ropes were scattered, iron railings had been displaced and twisted. Water had clawed high up the face of the cliff and left the marks of its reach. Night came early. Moore and a small relief party kept the light burning through the dark. Captain James Harvey returned to briskly to telegraph the news. The Northern Lighthouse Board, the authority that supervised lights in that part of the world, opened an inquiry. They knew the keepers at Eilean Mòr were trained and careful. They knew the rules. One keeper was always to remain inside the lighthouse. No one was to approach the west landing in heavy weather. Life belts were to be worn near the cliffs. Every motion mattered because one misstep could mean a fall, and one large wave could sweep a man away as if he were a twig. Investigators listened to Joseph Moore's account. They studied the log. They examined the reports about weather from the days around the disappearance. They considered the damage at the west landing. Clothing evidence suggested that 2 men had gone out in sea boots and weather gear, perhaps to secure equipment. A wearing coat left behind suggested that the 3rd man had followed in a hurry, without the time to dress properly, as if responding to an urgent call from the others. The evidence pointed to the west landing, where the ropes and gear had been disturbed. A powerful wave could have swept up the gully and taken all 3 men in a single rush. That was the official conclusion. It explained the facts in a clean, tragic line. A check at the landing during a storm, a sudden surge, 3 men gone. Yet from the moment the Hesperus sounded the horn and heard no reply, the case began to drift into something larger than an accident report. The setting felt like a story. An empty lighthouse at the world's edge, a light that went dark, 3 men who had simply ceased to be. And so more questions spread, the kind that pull at people in a way a neat answer does not. No bodies were found. No shouts were heard by anyone on passing ships. Why had the light gone out days earlier? Had the keepers taken a risk, or had something strange happened on the rock? That is where the legend starts its slow, steady rise. When a story carries mystery, the wind tends to add to it. In the months and years that followed, newspapers and books retold the case with extra color. Some spoke of a log entry that described the men as fearful, praying, and seeing huge waves that ran high above the island. Others told that the kitchen table still held a meal half-eaten. Still others suggested that one man's coat had been left behind because he had rushed out in sudden panic. With each retelling, the room seemed to grow colder and the sea seemed to take a darker shape. But those dramatic details do not stand on solid ground. The official records do not show a half-eaten meal. The eerie log entries about terror and storms are not accepted as genuine by serious researchers. They appear to be additions made later by storytellers. The facts that can be held in hand remain simple and few. The men were gone, the light was out, the west landing was damaged, 2 heavy coats were gone and 1 remained. Even with the myths stripped away, the case is full of fascination. The Flannan Isles sit where weather turns fast. A calm morning can become a gray blur by noon. The west landing is a funnel of stone where the ocean gathers itself and leaps upward. A single line in a report about the damage there is like the corner of a photograph that suggests a larger scene. It is not hard to picture 2 keepers in oilskins going down to the landing to check a box of ropes or to secure a piece of gear that had shaken loose in the gale. Perhaps they were careful, but a line whipped free and threatened to swing. Perhaps they needed more hands and called back to the lighthouse. The 3rd man, hearing them, came running. He threw aside his work and left in his shirt sleeves or his indoor clothes, thinking he would only be gone a moment. A swell rolled in, larger than the others. It struck the landing, broke, and sent water like a wall up the rock. 3 men, 1 wave. The lighthouse looked down, empty. The simplicity of that picture is part of its power. But human nature looks for what else might be there. In quiet rooms far from the sea, other ideas took shape. Some said that one of the men might have turned violent, that an argument had ended in a fight near the cliff, and that a scuffle had sent all 3 over the edge. There is no evidence of a struggle in the lighthouse, and the men's records do not show a quarrel that would build to that, but people still whispered. Some pointed to Donald MacArthur's reputation as a man with a temper, and from there they built a tale. It does not take much to turn a reputation into a motive in the minds of listeners who want a twist. Others floated the idea of a crime from the sea, pirates or a wandering band of criminals, or perhaps a passing ship that took the men and left no trace. But no sign of such a ship exists in the records for those days, and the island offers little cover for a stealthy visit. A small boat would have had to pull up at the landing in heavy seas, make the climb, and then leave with 3 men and no one watching from the lighthouse or the hills nearby. It reads like a scene from a novel more than a real sequence of events. Then, as always happens when a story feels too thin, the supernatural was pulled in. Ghosts of monks from long ago, a sea creature, a light in the sky, strange singing in the wind. The Flannan Isles had a name that sounded old and otherworldly. A tiny chapel stood on Eilean Mòr for centuries before the lighthouse, and some travelers even said a path around it must be walked with respect. When a modern tragedy arrived in such a place, people fed that old mood with new ideas. But again, nothing in the evidence points to anything beyond stone, water, wind, and human decision. The strongest thing supporting the simple theory is the place itself. The West Landing sits beneath a steep face. Waves do not always run up in even rhythm. Every so often, a larger set can surge and climb where others only strike and fall back. On an island under constant assault by weather, the moorings and boxes had to be checked and secured. Heavy ropes, if left where the wind could whip them, could turn into a hazard. If two keepers went down to fix a problem, and a third joined in haste, not wanting his friends to fight the sea with only 4 hands, the scene is set, one man near the edge, one man holding a line, another bending to secure a shackle. The watchman in the tower turns, expecting to hear their steps again soon. The wave is already rising. But even if that is what happened, the mind goes back to the unanswered details. Why was the light not burning that night when the passing ship looked for it? If the men were already gone by then, that explains it. But then, when exactly did they vanish? Why did no body wash up on nearby shores when the tide often returns what it takes? The Atlantic does not promise to give back what it takes, of course, but the lack of physical trace leaves room for wonder. And wonder is the oxygen that keeps a mystery alive. Now picture the days just before the Hesperus reached the island. A gull watches the horizon from a perch on the rail. The lighthouse windows are dull in the winter sun. No smoke rises from the building. At sea level, the ladder at the landing shines wet. On the mainland, in a harbor where the tender waits for the weather to turn, men sleep in their bunks and wake when the wind changes. They curry the engine, check the lines, talk in short sentences about waves and luck. They do not know they are about to find an empty station. When they do reach Eilean Mòr and climb and step into rooms where every simple thing has been left in place by hands that will never return, the feeling that hits is colder than the spray. It is the feeling of a boundary crossed. Not the boundary between land and sea, but the thin line between a normal day and a story that breaks loose from a timeline and becomes something else. The Hesperus crew lit the lantern that night and kept the watch because that was their duty. But inside their heads, an echo began that has never faded. An official report can use words like accidental, swept away, heavy seas, and West Landing. Those words are strong and credible, and they fit with what the searchers found. Yet the reason this case refuses to sit down in the file of finished events is that it also offers a human core that tugs at listeners. 3 men worked together under pressure for weeks. They relied on one another. They shared meals, looked out windows at the same horizon, and took turns minding the flame that saved strangers out at sea. Their last moments, whatever they were, likely involved duty rather than fear, securing equipment, protecting others, making one more trip outside to help. That image touches something in anyone who hears it. It replaces shadowy fantasy with a deeper kind of awe, that people risk themselves for simple reasons and sometimes pay with everything. Still, it is fair to ask whether the official theory accounts for every detail. The island's damage shows that storm waves had reached high. Could a wave rise far enough to sweep 3 men at once? On that coast in winter, yes. The terrain forms channels that can throw water upward like stone-bladed plows. The reports note that equipment was tossed about. Railings are not hard-proof, but they are a sign of impact. And remember the oilskins. If the coats of 2 men were missing, those 2 likely dressed for the weather. The third coat still on its hook suggests a man who ran out in a hurry, which lines up with one man answering another's shout or a sudden need. It is not a strange leap. It is the kind of quick judgment that happens on job sites every day, the kind of choice made in seconds that a person would make without thinking, especially in a tight-knit crew. The passage of time has not brought new hard facts. Instead, it has added layers of telling and retelling. A novelist might place a cracked teacup in that kitchen, a stopped clock pointing to a precise minute, a note in a margin, a bird that seems to know too much, or a set of footprints that lead to the edge and stop. Real life refused those props. The clock did stop. That is true. Clocks stop when no one winds them. The lantern was not lit. That is also true. No one was there to light it after that last day. The log did not contain a theatrical account of terror or prayer that anyone can prove. The men were trained. They were observant. Their notes in the days before the disappearance likely reflected weather and chores, not a poem of doom. It is the silence itself, the space where later readers wanted more, that encouraged invention. If a listener seeks a frightening moment, it can be found in the simple act of Joseph Moore walking into the lighthouse for the first time on December 26th. Picture a small, tight entry space where men had pulled off wet boots 100 times. Picture the hook on the wall where a heavy coat still hangs. Picture footprints that stop at a threshold, the faint smell of oil, the sound of the wind sliding around the corners of the building, and the sense that the air inside is colder than it should be. That is the first suspense beat that matters. It is not a ghost story, but it feels like one, because a place without people feels wrong when it is a place built for people's hands. A second moment rises later that day when searchers reach the west landing and see what the sea has done. The platform is worn and battered, ropes lie in places where they should not be. Iron shows the scars of impact. Imagine a keeper's mind considering that scene and then matching it to the missing coats. The shape of an answer appears, and the shape brings no comfort. It tells of men for whom help was too late even before it was called. A third moment arrives when the Hesperus has to leave. The tender does not get to stay at the island. It has to turn and head back with the news, and with men who must stand at railings and watch the white tower shrink against the grey of the sky. The light is burning that night because the relief crew lit it. But the island has no keepers of its own. The crew on the ship can still see that bright eye turning over black water. That light is supposed to mean safety, order, and human presence. On that night it means vacancy. The symbol has been turned inside out. Over and over the mind checks other paths. Could there have been a landslide, a fall at the cliff edge, a sudden injury that caused panic and drew all three men to one spot where the sea could take them together? These are possible, but they are only small variations on the larger theme. One man in trouble and two who refuse to leave him. That is how crews think and move. Even if a fall began the chain of events, the final act still belongs to the wave. Over and over the mind checks other paths. Could there have been a landslide, a fall at the cliff edge, a sudden injury that caused panic and drew all three men to one spot where the sea could take them together? These are possible, but they are only small variations on the larger theme. One man in trouble and two who refuse to leave him. That is how crews think and move. Even if a fall began the chain of events, the final act still belongs to the wave. The idea of one keeper turning on the others says more about the appetite for drama than about evidence. In small stations, tension can rise. Long nights, short tempers, and the weight of responsibility all press on men. But the lack of a scene inside makes this theory weak. If a fight had broken out that ended in disaster, there would likely be signs, and there are none that stand the test of careful reading. A rumor about a man's temper cannot stand in for footprints on a floor or marks on a wall. So the story circles back to sea and weather, as simple and as merciless as they have always been. Simplicity does not dull the edge of the tale. If anything, it sharpens it. The listener arrives at a place where there is no villain to hate, no clever scheme to uncover, only the fact that humans built a small outpost against the wild, and that sometimes the wild steps over the line. In that sense, the case is a form of true crime, without a human criminal. The suspect is the sea itself, and the evidence shows means, motive, and opportunity. There is one more layer to consider, the pull of isolation. The Flannan Isles were not a place where neighbors could drop by. The keepers worked to a set routine, and that routine is what kept them safe. It kept them in the lighthouse when the weather was too dangerous, and it kept them in pairs when a task had to be done at a landing. When a routine breaks, accidents rush in. Perhaps a piece of gear came loose and threatened to damage more if not secured. Perhaps there was a small fire risk from a swinging line or a banging box. The trained mind says, "Fix it now, it will only take a minute." The trained body acts. That is how a weak link in a chain can pull a whole team into danger. The island has no backup, there is no one else to call. If a keeper sees a problem, he solves it, or it does not get solved. That dynamic, paired with the violence of the weather, can explain how three men end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. The event's afterlife in culture and memory has kept it alive for more than a century. Songs, poems, and stories have been made about it. Some aim for mood, some for fear, some for a chilling twist. But when the noise is filtered out, the core remains grounded. The date, the names, the place, the tender that came too late, the investigation that pointed to a single wave, and the many quiet nights since then when ships passed that white tower and looked up to see the light turn. The lighthouse did not know it held a mystery, it only knew its duty. An unsolved case is a mirror, people see in it what they bring to it. Those who fear the unknown see hints of something beyond understanding. Those who trust in cause and effect see the evidence and accept that the sea can erase a human trace as easily as a hand wipes clean a slate. Those who love a good story see a setting and cast and leave the ending undefined to keep the story alive a little longer. The Flannan Isles mystery has room for all of those. It can absorb each telling and still sit there, fixed in time, with the same hard facts staring back. Yet something more gentle lives inside the story if it is looked at from another angle. On the days before the men vanished, each small task they did matters. One cleaned the lens so it would shine clear. One checked the oil. One walked the path to the landing and made sure the lines were secure. Those simple acts helped strangers far away in cold, wet darkness. The lighthouse keeper's work is humble heroism. If the last thing those men did was rush to secure a line so that the light and the station would be safe for the next storm, then their final act fits perfectly with their calling. There is dignity in that, and a kind of peace. Tragedy, yes, but not meaninglessness. Still, the mind steps back to the image of a missing coat on its hook, and a cold room that should have been warm, and wonders. That hook is a hook in the story itself. It keeps the listener from drifting too far and reminds them of the tiny details that got left behind. Someone hung that coat, someone set down a mug, someone wrote the last line in the log. Then life picked up speed in a place where life usually moves slow, and the ordinary day became a thin edge. The difference between safety and danger is often measured in minutes, sometimes in seconds. The keepers lived always with that truth. The island forced that awareness on them. The last day turned that truth into a final judgment. Decades later, visitors can stand where the lighthouse looks down on the west landing and listen to the wind that sings in the cables and the cry of birds that nest on the ledges. The sea below does not remember. It does not keep score. It only moves. The white tower above has seen crew after crew come and go, new lamps brought in, new rules written, new technology added. Some things change so much that a modern keeper would not believe the old days. Other things do not change at all. Waves still climb. Ropes still need to be tied, people still rush to help others, and stories still need a place to live. Eilean Mòr has become one of those places. It is tempting to want a final revelation, a secret letter found in a drawer, a skull washed up and identified, a long-lost report that fills in every blank. But the more likely truth is that this case will remain as it is, a sturdy shape carved out of a few facts and a great deal of ocean air. That is not a failure. It is a kind of respect for the reality of risk and for the men who faced it. Their names deserve to be said: James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. They were not figures in a ghost story. They were workers who kept a light burning for others until, one day, something larger than their strength took them away. So the last suspense beat in this story lands here in the present. The listener is left with a question that has no single correct answer. When a mystery offers a simple explanation and a dozen strange alternatives, which one is chosen? The official inquiry delivered a conclusion grounded in the world everyone knows: heavy weather and a wave strong enough to take 3 men from a rock. Many will accept that, some will not, because a shadow on a wall can be more exciting than the beam from a lamp. But even those who prefer the darker path feel, if only for a second, the pull of the real place, the cold spray, the slick stone, the clatter of a rope box in the wind, and sense how close a quiet duty can be to disaster. The lighthouse stands today as a symbol of what humans try to do against that kind of risk. Build something, light a flame, set rules, write notes, show up for shifts, do the job. The disappearance at Eilean Mòr is not only unsolved, it is also a reminder that even when the answers are practical and plain, the stories we make from them can hold power for generations. That is the deep current running beneath all the rumors and all the drama. In the end, the island keeps its secret, the sea keeps what it takes. And the wind keeps whispering around the lantern room, past the glass panes and the iron braces, over the path to the west landing, and along the rail where a gull watches another winter storm roll in. Somewhere out there, a ship moves through the dock, and a crew looks for a fixed light to guide them. That is what the keepers worked for every day. That is what they gave everything to protect, even if the last thing they ever saw was a wall of water rising from the black. The case remains open in the only way it can be. Inside the minds of those who hear it, maybe the 3 men were swept off the landing while securing gear, all taken by one rogue wave. Maybe a fall, a cry for help, a chain reaction. Maybe, as the folk tales say, something stranger. Each version says more about the teller than about the island, but all of them return to the same stark image. A locked world of rock and wind, a light that goes dark, and footsteps that lead nowhere. That image is why the story endures. It is why it belongs on a shelf with other true and haunting cases that never found their last page. If this story stirred something, if the empty lighthouse and the missing men followed along and kept a grip as the minutes passed, share what feels most convincing. Was it the wave? Was it a tragic chain of events? Or is there another detail that stands out? Leave a comment with the theory that makes the most sense, or the moment that chilled the blood. Subscribe for more unsolved cases that hold the same quiet weight. Like the video to help others find this story. And keep listening. More mysteries wait beyond the light.